Welcome to Wyoming's Health Watch. I'm attorney Jason Oakes, and here you'll learn the most up-to-date information about dangerous drugs, dangerous products, and safety news with hopes that it just might prevent a catastrophe. Let's get started.
Thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about talcum powder this evening, and this caught my attention again this week because of a great article in Reuters, and if you haven't had a chance to read it, I strongly encourage it. It was a fascinating deep dive into how I think the easiest way you could sum it up is how the FDA has failed to protect the very people they are charged to protect, which is the U.S. consumer, as it relates to the risk of asbestos and talcum powder. And I thoroughly enjoyed the article. I put it out on my LinkedIn page. If you haven't had a chance to find it, you can find it there, and I also tweeted it at Oakes Law. Check it out. It's a great read. It's very in-depth, and it's well-researched. But I took some information from what I learned in that article together with information we have learned in the litigation that is not under protective order, and also from a number of colleagues that I've spoken about. We here at the Oakes Law Firm, we've been involved in the talcum powder litigation since 2016, and it's been ongoing for quite some time. It hasn't, in my view, gotten the attention that I think it deserves, and not so much the litigation, but the risk that is genuinely involved with this talcum powder. It just doesn't permeate the news wires like so many other things are doing right now, and it's probably because there's just a lot of other things that are taking people's attention right now. But the talcum powder, the arguments that have been raised by plaintiffs' lawyers in the talcum powder litigation stem from the contamination of asbestos in the talc when it's mined at its original source, and that this asbestos has not been fully removed from the talc by the time it gets to the bottle, by the time it gets to the retail shelf, and certainly by the time it gets to home, where it is used either on, most frequently on women and also babies. So our most vulnerable groups, one could say, although there have been even reports of men coming down with cancer as a result of exposure to talcum powder. So men are not out of the loop on this at all. Interestingly, it was really from pressure from the litigation and also the enormous verdicts that were coming out of the litigation that started putting pressure on the FDA to start actually doing their job and start testing some of these talcum powder products as they came through the FDA for various sample testing. And primarily this is Johnson & Johnson, because Johnson & Johnson is actually the world's largest talcum provider. They mine an enormous amount of it and purchase an enormous amount of it and virtually dominate this arena. But because of the scrutiny that's been on them as a result of litigation, just in October, less than 2 months ago, the U.S. FDA, in fact, had one of their outfits that they had contracted with to test the talcum powder discovered the asbestos in the talcum powder, and there was an immediate recall of a certain lot number, of which 33,000 bottles of talc were recalled and removed from retailer shelves all over the country. And this was this also flew under the radar for whatever reason. It just didn't hit the news wires as much as I would have guessed. But in any event, there was a confirmation through the FDA that asbestos was found. And so what I want to talk about from this point is kind of how this began in terms of talcum powder and asbestos and the relationship to one another and the history, and I'll make it a brief history of kind of what transpired all the way back to the 1970s is where this story begins. It should be noted that 12 days, or I think it was 11 days after the most recent recall of the 33,000 bottles of baby powder, Johnson & Johnson set out a press release that said it had hired an outfit to test the various bottles, and they claim that they found no asbestos in any of the bottles. And that has been their position from day one, and it has been their position in the litigation. There is no asbestos whatsoever in the talcum powder. As I said, the story begins in 1971, so we're obviously talking 50 years ago, when the FDA began looking into talc safety. And this was after researchers at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York found what appeared to be asbestos in unnamed brands of talcum powder. 2 years later, the FDA records show that the agency found asbestos in a sample of shower-to-shower talcum powder, and this is a J&J powder product. And at the time, it was made with the same talcum powder as Johnson's baby powder. The FDA, though, never publicly announced this finding, and this, again, was in 1973. Interestingly, 3 years later, in 1976, the FDA, having been assured by J&J and other manufacturers that talcum powder was safe, they agreed to allow these various talcum powder associations and groups to establish a quasi-company and trade group of their own, and they called it the Cosmetic, Toiletry, and Fragrance Association. And essentially they represented the FDA that they would police themselves when it came to talcum powder. And they were successful in persuading FDA officials that these manufacturers could properly monitor the safety of their own products. And this was disclosed in various records J&J had produced in the litigation. So the FDA dropped what they had planned to do, which was impose testing and purity standards for talc powders and cosmetics. They totally dropped that with the assurance that this new outfit that was run by the manufacturers of talcum powder would police themselves. The trade group published its own test for analyzing asbestos contamination. And this test, though, was voluntary for companies to use. There was nothing that required any sort of mandatory use of this test. And the written standard for that test acknowledges that it cannot detect most types of asbestos at low levels. And most importantly, and listen to this carefully, it cannot detect a certain type of asbestos referred to as chrysotile. And this is the asbestos fiber. And you probably need a little bit of a background when it comes to asbestos to fully understand and capture what's going on here. Chrysotile, or let me back up. The asbestos breaks down into teeny tiny fibers. Those fibers you cannot see, you cannot smell, you cannot taste. And they get inhaled into the lungs and they wreak holy havoc on the lungs. And it creates a signature disease called mesothelioma. And you've probably, most of you, everybody's heard of mesothelioma. But if you've never had the unpleasant experience of meeting someone who's at the last stage of their mesothelioma, consider yourself lucky. We tried the only case that's ever been tried in Wyoming, asbestos mesothelioma case back in November of 2016 in federal court. We had a number of defendants. All of them settled out before trial, and we had one last defendant who was a real kind of on-the-edge supplier that we had very scant evidence with, but nonetheless we gave it a shot. And I had the very unpleasant experience of having to videotape my dying client because we knew that he would not survive long enough to make trial in that case. And we videotaped that deposition. It was a very painful, emotionally heart-wrenching deposition where he shared on video how this disease was slowly suffocating him, was slowly making him, as he said, feel like he was drowning in his own fluids. And that is indeed what mesothelioma does. It's a horrible disease. And when we got to trial, he had passed at that point, and we had to play his video to establish what we needed to establish in that case. And it was just a very heart-wrenching video to watch, not only for me, but obviously for his remaining wife and his daughter. So I share that this is not a disease that you would ever take lightly. It is a horrible disease, and you wouldn't wish this disease on your worst enemy. So when these fibers break down, there's a number of fibers that have been identified. As I said, chrysotile is one of them, and chrysotile is kind of the one that you hear. You may not hear of chrysotile, but when you hear of asbestos, you hear of it most often. It's the one that you've heard about being in roofs and ceilings and walls and floors of homes and businesses. And this is one that manufacturers also use in automobile brake linings and gaskets and boiler seals and insulation for pipes and ducts and appliances. I mean, this is kind of the main one. And then there's another one called amosite, They call this the brown asbestos, and by the way, chrysotile is referred to as the white asbestos. Amosite's the brown asbestos, and this is the one you probably most would frequently find in cement sheets and pipe insulation before it was outlawed. And then there's crocitolite, referred to as the blue asbestos, and this was most commonly used to insulate, for example, steam engines. It was also used sometimes on spray-on coatings or pipe insulation in plastics and cement products. And then finally there was anthophyllite, which was used in limited quantities for insulation products and some construction materials, but you didn't see it nearly as often as the other ones. And I said that was final, but I was incorrect. There was also tremolite. And tremolite are not used commercially, but they can be found as contaminants in chrysotile asbestos and things like talc. And in chrysolite, the very fiber that I mentioned a moment ago was one that could not be detected by the trade group's published testing, is the most frequently and most commonly used form of asbestos, chrysotile. So conveniently, when you start to look at the history of this, you identify that the most frequently used is the one that wasn't even capable of being detected by these particular tests. Now I'll fast forward for a moment. In October of this year, 2019, it was indeed chrysotile, which was discovered in the asbestos that initiated the recall. So moving on, that kind of calmed the FDA, if you even want to say calm. That just kind of gave the FDA an excuse not to do anything up until about 1983. So we're now about 12 years after 1971, when the folks at Mount Sinai discovered asbestos in talcum powder. And 1983 was an interesting year because there were talc safety concerns that surfaced as a result of a graduate student who was looking through geology journals for a toxicology class that he came across, and he found information that he considered extremely disturbing, and this was talc deposits that are commonly laced with asbestos, which is also a very similar mineral to talc. And he was particularly concerned about it because his sister had a little baby, and he was well familiar with his sister's ritual of placing talcum powder and Johnson & Johnson's talcum powder on her little girl every time she changed her diaper. He decided he was going to petition the FDA and ask that they require an asbestos warning on talc powders. So ladies and gentlemen, this is now 1983, 40 years ago, that this gentleman, his name was Philippe Doulet, who submitted his own petition, which you can do. It's called the Citizens Petition, and I've got other podcasts, if you're interested in that, on other citizens petitions that have been filed. Anybody can do it. But you have to have some evidence to support it, and he did because of the graduate student geology journals that he had pulled. But when the FDA started looking at his petition, it then reached out to who else but J&J to find information that might assist them in their investigation. And ultimately, the FDA's in June of 1985, the FDA's risk assessment relied upon a 10-year-old letter from J&J for the agency's estimate of the amount of dust babies were exposed to during diapering. And as a result of that, the FDA was satisfied that there was not any sort of substantial risk with the amount of dust that was being potentially inhaled by babies. And that letter said that even hypothetically, of course they wouldn't admit there was asbestos, so they said hypothetically, even if babies were exposed to talcum powder with as much as 1% asbestos, it would be a far lower concentration than allowed at the time for industrial workers. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've known that asbestos at no levels are safe for anyone dating back more than 50 years. The literature on this is very clear, and you can imagine if the levels are zero for a healthy grown adult like myself and like anybody listening to this podcast, what on earth could potentially happen to a small infant whose lungs have barely developed if they inhale one of these fibers? But nonetheless, it satisfied the FDA. They felt there was sufficient information, and they ended the investigation and informed Mr. Doulet that they were not going to do anything with respect to his petition. Interestingly, there was agency officials at the FDA had come to question earlier reported findings of asbestos and talcum powders because of this investigation. However, those items were based in part on a paper published in the Proceedings of a 1977 scientific conference. Interestingly, both of the paper's authors had worked for J&J, one as an asbestos testing contractor and the other as its longtime talc supply manager. Interesting, huh? The authors argued that some testing methods were apt to misidentify microscopic look-alike rock splinters as asbestos, and the industry's test, the paper said, was designed to avoid this confusion. So, in other words, it was almost like the blurring of the lines. They're just trying to make the matter even more confusing, and that they represented that this particular test that they were now utilizing had solved these issues where before they couldn't detect this asbestos, now they could. But we now know, going back and looking at this information, that the only fibers that they could detect were missed the very fiber that was most likely to be in the talcum powder, the chrysotile. So again, it kind of dies down at this point, again, because the FDA is relying, in my view, way too heavily on J&J, who has every incentive in the world to protect one of their greatest products of all time in terms of revenue. So nothing happens much until 1994, about 8 years or so later. And this is when a new citizens petition gets submitted for a warning label on talcum powders, but it's a little different than the earlier ones. This one came from a Dr. Samuel Epstein, who worked at the University of Illinois Environmental Center and who also chaired the Cancer Prevention Coalition, which was an advocacy group at the time. His petition wasn't concerning asbestos, interestingly enough. It raised the possibility that talcum powder by itself was a hazard worthy of a warning label, and his petition was based on research showing that talcum powder, when used as an antiperspirant or deodorant in underwear, was associated with ovarian cancer. This is in 1994, ladies and gentlemen, so a good 30 years ago almost. So this was investigated similarly to how the 1983 incident was investigated. There was a request to J&J for more information. In a brief July 1995 letter, this is fascinating. Listen to this. The FDA acting cosmetics chief, a guy by the name of John Bailey, he contended that Epstein's coalition, that the agency had taken no action because it had other priorities. In other words, he responded to Epstein a year later and told them that the FDA had not taken any action because they had other things more important, I guess. And as a side note, John Bailey, the cosmetics head of the FDA at that time, is now a paid litigation expert witness to J&J in the ongoing litigation. So it just dies on the vine. Nothing happens. Fast forward now, that occurred in 1994. Again, nothing's going on until roughly 2006. Okay, so we're now about 15 years ago. In 2006, the World Health Organization, the WHO, International Agency for Research on Cancer, classifies the use of talcum powder in the perineum area, the pelvic region between the legs, as possibly carcinogenic. 2 years later, Illinois medical scientist Epstein, the same guy, files a second petition to the FDA seeking a cancer warning label on talc products, again with respect to ovarian cancer. Now, the World Health Organization, I know quite a bit about the World Health Organization. First of all, they take the job of trying to discover and find out dangerous products very seriously. And one thing that I think gives them a tremendous amount of credibility is you have to provide a full list of information about your background, about who you've ever worked with, about who you've ever been paid by, going back more than a decade before you even get considered to be part of their team. They want to make sure that there are absolutely no conflicts, that there are absolutely truly people who have no underlying purpose with their review of information, and that are genuinely there to make a decision based on simply the evidence and the facts that are presented to them. And so when the WHO, the World Health Organization, concludes that certain items are dangerous or carcinogenic or possibly carcinogenic, it is something that, in my view, needs to be very seriously considered and appreciated. So, before the FDA ruled on these warning requests that had occurred with the Wyoming Health Organization and also Epstein's, there was additional concerns about asbestos contamination in these products that had flared up again. And this time, it was the FDA's South Korean counterpart that reported finding asbestos and talcum powder. And this really threw the FDA for a loop because the lab in South Korea had no experience ever testing for asbestos and talc. Its prior work had focused on building materials like vinyl flooring and those sorts of things, and there had been some discovery there, but not with respect to talcum powder. And but the FDA has contended that Saldivar's lab did use, and I quote, the most sensitive techniques available, end quote, but also cautioned that the results were limited to the various talcum powders and cosmetics they tested. Interestingly, Saldivar's lab was the very one that FDA rehired recently to do an independent test, and that was what triggered the October 2019 discovery of asbestos that led to the 33,000 bottles being removed off the shelves just about 6 or 7 weeks ago. So whatever sort of testing Saldivar's South Korean outfit is using, it seems to be working. So let's go now to April of 2014, and listen, this is disturbing. In April of 2014, mind you, this is 20 years, 2 decades after Epstein first contacted the agency with his citizen's petition regarding the ovarian cancer. The FDA then contacted Epstein, rejecting both of his petitions for warning labels. And in fact, they had not, in my understanding, is they had never contacted him regarding the first one in terms of an official declaration or review or conclusion on that. But 20 years later, after that, 1994, they did and rejected both. And they contended that the science wasn't strong enough to support a cancer warning, and also echoed the assessment of J&J and its industry partners had presented to the agency just a couple years or 5 years earlier in 2009, when the FDA had approached J&J and other industry leaders and asking them for information that may assist them in this investigation. So that's where we're at. And even today, I pulled a Johnson & Johnson baby powder canister off the shelf at my local Albertsons just a month ago, right after the recall occurred. I actually went in there to make sure, I checked all the lot numbers to make sure that they weren't there. And thankfully, there weren't any lot numbers on my Albertsons store shelf. But I was interested in the warnings, and I did a podcast on the warnings. Go to WyomingHealthWatch.com and just pull the Johnson & Johnson baby powder warnings podcast. It's a short podcast, and I'll read them. I just read them to you. But there's nothing on ovarian cancer, and there's certainly nothing on mesothelioma. And in fact, there's just one little comment about try not to inhale, but it doesn't tell you why. And yet, we sit here today with about 16,000 lawsuits that have been filed in the federal court system, contending that exposure to J&J's talcum powder has caused an enormous amount of pain, an enormous amount of horrific living for women who have contracted ovarian cancer, and for another group that contends they've been caused to contract mesothelioma. The future, I think, is a little uncertain at this time. That Johnson & Johnson has won some cases. They have. But when they lose big. There was a $4 billion verdict not long ago where there was a case involving 22 women with ovarian cancer that was tried. And in that case, the contention was, and remember, keep in mind, Johnson & Johnson has never admitted that there was asbestos contaminated, but the experts on our side, on the plaintiff side, contend that the analysis that's being done by Johnson & Johnson is an analysis that isn't sensitive enough to pick up these microscopic fibers. And so, for example, let me give you a kind of a visual on how to think about this. If you have a bathroom scale, we've all seen those. And this is what the plaintiff experts contended Johnson & Johnson was doing, and this is a kind of an illustration, but if you have a bathroom scale, let's say you go pick up out of your wife or your mom's knitting kit one of those teeny tiny knitting needles, and you put that on a bathroom scale. That bathroom scale is not going to register it. It will be as though nothing's there. And the illustration is that Johnson & Johnson's testing wasn't sensitive enough to pick up these fibers, so it would not show up on these specific tests. And also it's the plaintiff's contention that was purposeful. The J&J knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't want to pick up detection of these fibers for obvious reasons. Yet, if you had, and the plaintiff's experts contended, if you had the correct testing that was sensitive enough to pick it up, then it would pick up this needle. And you couldn't use for example, a bathroom scale. You would have to use one of those jeweler scales that is ultra sensitive. That is the illustration of the type of difference in terms of what needed to be used to pick up the sensitivity of finding these fibers. That argument was successful, and it led to an enormous verdict. There have been a number of other enormous verdicts. There was a $72 million verdict that came out of St. Louis, Missouri, about a year and a half ago. And when the verdicts have hit, they have hit enormously. And I don't think Johnson & Johnson can continue to litigate these cases endlessly. Certainly they'll win some statistically, but when they lose, and they will lose statistically, they're going to lose enormously. In 16,000 cases, not only is an enormous exposure to Johnson & Johnson, not only from verdicts point of view, but also from the massive amount of attorney's fees that are going to be required to litigate all those cases. So that's where it stands right now. I don't see, I've had some people ask me, well, what about the FDA? Why, are they going to put any warnings? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that because of the litigation and because of the big verdicts that have come out, it has put pressure on the FDA to do something. And I can only hope that they will finally stop bowing down to corporate pressure and do the right thing, and at least put the warnings on the bottle that give every American the choice, the informed choice, the honest informed choice to decide if they want to use this product on themselves or their child ever again. Lastly, and this is another issue that's come up in the litigation, is there are safer alternatives. There have been cornstarch powders out there that are every bit as good as talcum powder, that is every bit as effective, and has been out there for much longer, and is accomplishes the same goal. But you know what the difference is? Cornstarch costs more for manufacturers than mining the talcum powder does. So, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you, if you have a chance, I've tried to capture not only some great info in that Reuters article, but also include information that we've learned through the litigation. A lot of the information, almost most of it, is now public record because of the trials, because there's a public policy that trials are to be public, and that there's no policy behind keeping information away from the American people in a public trial, in a public courtroom. So I've been very pleased that we've been able to get a lot of this information out. But please don't kid yourself. If you have any young family members in your family that may be having kids or have kids, get the baby powder out of their homes. Get rid of it. If you have anyone, God forbid, who's come down to ovarian cancer, was previously using baby powder, don't get rid of the baby powder. Put it. I'm urging people, put it in a mason jar and seal it up and put it somewhere where nobody can ever get exposed to it, because it may be a Exhibit A for any type of lawsuit. People who can show that they actually still have the baby powder, that's a stronger position to have in the lawsuit than simply recollection. Not that recollection isn't good, that can suffice, but if you have the actual product, do keep it, but just preserve it in a way where it cannot get out and cannot expose anybody to the dangers that asbestos creates. I hope that this was helpful. I hope it was informative. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to listen to other podcasts, please go to WyomingHealthWatch.com. Otherwise, I'm Jason Oakes. Have a great evening.